Well, the end of December is traditionally a time to look back and reflect on the year that was. And what better person to review the political comings and goings of 2023 than this guy, the director of the Marquette Law School poll, Charles Franklin. Welcome back.
Good to be here. Last time of the year, I presume.
Yes.
Something really happens this week.
So a lot of stuff, state politics, a lot of stuff going on there.
It's a busy year. You know, if you kind of go through chronologically, we had the Supreme Court election, then we had the budget. In the fall, we've got the decision on redistricting, so a lot happening. I think, you know, the Supreme Court election we can talk more about, but the things that the legislature and the governor were able to agree on were kind of notable. That we got a bipartisan bill on school funding for both public and voucher schools. We got shared revenue that expanded shared revenue throughout the state, but especially gave property or sales tax options to Milwaukee City and County. That's a big deal. And, you know, we got a budget passed on time. In the Brewer Stadium, can't forget that one too. So I don't want to oversell the bipartisanship, and there were people unhappy with all of those from both sides of the aisle. But that's what happens if you actually want a bipartisan compromise.
A little light at the end of the tunnel there.
Maybe a little bit. I don't want to overpromise on that, but a little bit.
And the Supreme Court election ramifications for next year.
Absolutely, because it flipped the majority on the court. The redistricting decision that just came out this month is the first step in the ramifications of that. Those new districts are supposed to be submitted by January 19th or 12th, I believe. So there's still time to go on that and maybe appeals, but it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about this most recent redistricting decision?
Yeah, it sets up the redistricting process. As I understand it, both the legislature and the governor can submit plans, but if they fail to agree on a plan, the court can order the redistricting. They'll have an expert do the redistricting. I think there are a couple of things there. One is it could have big ramifications. The nearly two-thirds majority of Republicans in the Assembly and the just over two-thirds in the Senate, state Senate, could be scaled back. On the other hand, the notion that the redistricting will automatically result in Democratic control is probably a bit of a stretch. Our best analysis at the law school is that probably Republicans have maybe a 5% majority in the legislature, but not the 64, 5, 6% majority that they have now.
Let's talk about the chaos in Washington. Kevin McCarthy, let's start there.
That one's in plentiful supply, don't you think? You know, McCarthy had a terrible time getting elected Speaker back in January. Then he was kicked out by just 8 members of his own party. And we went through another multiple rounds of voting to get a new Speaker. You would think that if, after all of that, it resolved some issues, then we would see things moving along, legislation moving along. But since Johnson became the Speaker, we haven't seen legislation moving along, and we face a January 19th deadline when the current budget continuing resolution runs out and funding for part of the government would shut down those days. So it's not really produced a lot. The chaos has not produced a resolution of some of the tensions within the GOP.
And we're still talking about the 2020 election.
That one never goes around. Maybe we'll be talking about that in 2028 when we come back.
All right, when we come back, we will look ahead to the upcoming year in politics. So stay with us. We're back with Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School poll, looking ahead to 2024, a big election year.
Yes, we'll have a lot going on. In the state, we'll have the Senate race as well as the presidential race. We've got the primaries coming up starting January 15th in the Iowa caucus. So there's going to be a little action during the year.
What do you think about Donald Trump being the GOP nominee?
You know, at this point, it looks like he's the absolute prohibitive favorite. There's one very narrow scenario, which would be a surprisingly strong performance by either Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis in Iowa, followed by an upset win in New Hampshire. And then it goes to South Carolina, Nikki Haley's home state. But Donald Trump is leading in the polls in South Carolina as well as in Iowa. New Hampshire's a bit closer. So I don't think that's a very likely scenario, but I do think I've learned not to say never on this.
Right.
And a lot of people are not looking forward to a rematch.
No, in all of our polling data, we see that people are unenthusiastic about having a rerun of 2020. We've seen this show before. We know the characters, we know the scripts. But if that's what the nominating process delivers, then come next fall, we really will see people face the choice between Trump or Biden or one of the third-party candidates that will likely be on the ballots. And so at that point, people will come to make their final decisions. I think everything from now through the summer is the time when you can still think, gee, what if I only had this other
Right.
candidate that I wanted? But sometime over the summer, we will know for sure who the nominees are going to be.
Well, specifically here in Wisconsin, I mean, Biden has targeted our state. He just visited, and earlier in the year as well, and Kamala Harris is expected to come too. Do you think the Democrats in our state are going to rally behind him?
Oh, I think certainly they will. And the campaign is putting their efforts here. Personal visits are the most indicative thing about priorities. But I think the issue will be, if you think of Trump won by 0.7 of a point or so, lost by 0.7 of a point or so, we are so close to how this could tip. And right now, Democrats are not enthusiastic about Biden as their nominee, though oddly, they like him quite a bit, like him slightly better than Republicans like Trump, as a matter of fact. They're just not enthusiastic about him running for the nomination or being the candidate. But that's exactly where, once you're faced with the real choices that we will see next summer, where you would expect both parties to rally behind their candidates. Trump has some never-Trump folks within his party that Biden doesn't quite have on the Democratic side. And then we have independents, and there are not a lot of independents, but they could tilt this race depending on how they feel about Joe Biden and how they feel about Donald Trump come next October.
And there's a lot of potential court appearances between now and then.
That'll be one of the most unusual, the most unusual thing is that Donald Trump could spend much of the campaign in court. Now, there's a big question of whether the early March, which is the first trial that's currently scheduled, whether it'll stick to that schedule. Trump's legal strategy is certainly to push those dates back, to delay as much as he can. So I don't know that we will see a court case actually get underway during the year, despite the schedule of them starting as soon as March. But it is entirely possible that at least over the summer or into the fall, one of those cases has started up. And there's just no precedent for that. But they are, unlike civil trials, the defendant is almost always required to be in court. Mm-hmm. So Trump actually could be in court 4 or 5 days a week through a good chunk of the year.
Wow.
Unprecedented.
Yes.
And they've got some big Supreme Court decisions coming?
A lot of them around Donald Trump, because those appeals on the gag order, on what presidential immunity, and on other things are all bubbling up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They haven't decided any of those cases yet, and so there are lower courts that are making decisions for now. But that'll involve the court in a lot of stuff. The court also has its usual important decisions, some involving guns, some involving abortion and abortion medication, for example. So we have a pretty lively year in the Supreme Court, too.
Big year coming up.
Never a dull moment. Never a dull moment.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
Charles, Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.